Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Alan Broadbent, the chair of our board, and our board members and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you here today to our session on investing in Toronto's future with our guest speaker, Peter Wallace, the city manager for Toronto. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Today's presentation is the 6th annual IMFG event with the Toronto City Manager, and the 3rd for Peter Wallace. But it's the first for Peter Wallace without the Blue Jays being in the ALCS. The idea behind this event is to give us an update every year of what has been happening at the city and what challenges and opportunities lie ahead. I don't have to tell this audience that Toronto is a fantastic city. It's fantastic, at least in part, because of the investments that we have made in the past. We know from Peter's previous presentations, however, that the city faces many challenges in continuing to meet the demands of being a global city. Today, we are going to hear how the City of Toronto can address these challenges and invest in Toronto's future. Before I introduce our moderator for this afternoon, I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, the Maitrey Foundation, the Province of Ontario, TD Bank Group, and the City of Toronto. I would also like to thank our team at IMFG for everything they did to make this event happen today. You've talked to them yourselves on many occasions, I know, Selena Zhang and Jamila Aladina. I would also like to thank the events staff of the Munk School and the technical staff, particularly Adam Bell of the Munk School. I would like to ask that you do not use flash photography today. Not that I think any of you were planning to do that, but we are webcasting the event, so that creates some problems. If you are tweeting about this event, and we encourage you to do that, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFGToronto. So on to the proceedings. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Sivan Palvetsian. Sivan has been CEO at Civic Action since January of 2014. Under her leadership, the organization has launched the Civic Action Leadership Foundation and 2 new initiatives focused on youth unemployment and mental health in the workplace. Before coming to Civic Action, Sivan held several senior executive roles within the Ontario government. Sivan is a member of the Premier's Community Hubs Advisory Group. I should get that right, I'm on the advisory group as well. The Toronto Police Service Board Transformational Task Force, and Mayor John Tory's advisory panel for international hosting opportunities. She also sits on the board of directors for the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council, TRIAC, NPower Canada, Waterfront Toronto, and she is a member of the Ivey Business School Leadership Council. Please welcome our moderator for today, Sivan Palvetsian.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be here. I am a big fan and have traditionally sat in those seats, very eager to hear the address of the city manager. So as Enid mentioned, this is the 6th time that we'd had the opportunity to hear from the city manager, and Peter's 3rd. And this is a very unique opportunity. Many of you will know that the City of Toronto has about 33,000 employees that work for it. So that's roughly the size of Stratford, Ontario, an entire village that powers this city. And we get to see on a daily basis the impact of their work, but we very rarely get to hear directly from the people that deliver that impact. It is the case, and Enid's right, I was a civil servant for about a decade, and it's the case that most public servants, we don't share names. You really only go in print if you earn 6 figures, if you break the law, or if you blow a whistle. But there are a few key roles where that is an exception, and certainly that is the case tonight. This is a very unique opportunity to hear from the head of the Toronto Public Service, and Peter will share a lot of great things I'm sure that you'll find very interesting. This is an annual pulse check. That's how I like to look at it. It's a pulse check of what's going on behind the scenes at City Hall by its nonpartisan leader. And I find it interesting to not only take the pulse of what's happening, but to look back historically and think, a year from now, Peter's remarks, and what did the city and the bigger backdrop, what did that include? And it's quite fascinating, actually. So a year ago, we very much thought that Hillary Clinton would be president. We had just signed, the ink was in fact drying on the Canada-EU trade deal. And City Council was deciding whether Toronto ought to take a run as host of Expo 2025. My, what a difference a year makes. Trump won, NAFTA appears to be imploding, and rather than agree to host a 19th century world fair, Toronto appears to be dating Google's little sister with Sidewalk Labs, and we're considering moving in with Amazon if in fact it does choose Toronto as its next headquarters. So some corners we get to see around, many others we can't. But it's Peter's job as city manager to do his best to try. Peter is about as credentialed as one could get for this role. With more than 30 years in public service, he has served as, ready? I have to read this. Secretary of the Cabinet, head of the Ontario Public Service, and clerk of the Executive Council, Deputy Minister of Finance and Secretary of Treasury Board, Deputy Minister of Energy, and Deputy Minister and Associate Secretary of the Cabinet. He began his public service career in 1981 after completing a BA Honours in Political Economy and a Masters of Public Administration right here at the University of Toronto. So would you please join me in welcoming to our stage our keynote speaker, Peter Wallace, and we'll be in conversation following his remarks. Thank you.
I love these buoyant introductions, and then I drag my clinically exhausted self up to the podium and try and live up to the expectations. I do very much appreciate the opportunity, Enid, Alan, and the sponsors for the opportunity to have a dialogue about things that matter. And we've gone over this ground a bunch of times before. City of Toronto really does matter. And the fiscal structure, our ability and capacity to deliver public services really are important. And I think it's an important and earnest dialogue. And it's a great joy to actually be in a position to have that dialogue with you. This is actually a policy nerd fest, and those of us who are here should actually question our use of time, but that doesn't frankly take away from the fact that numbers matter, trends matter, the way in which we approach public policy issues matter, and it is, and I appreciate Siobhan's introduction. I'm nonpartisan. And to try and actually have that dialogue from a more clinical or nonpartisan and technical perspective is not something that I can always enjoy in the context of City Council or in other contexts. It's a real pleasure to have this forum to be able to engage in that dialogue. And it is also a pleasure to actually be available to you and your questions a little bit later. So assuming I don't talk for the absolute all the time I have, I also look forward to hearing from you and having a dialogue and listening to your questions and hopefully answering some of them. A couple of important things from my perspective. The remarks I give, I think, are in the tradition set by Joe Panicetti and before that Shirley and others. Frankly, almost everything I say, and I think everything I say in this talk, is entirely consistent with what I've said in the past and entirely consistent with what they've said. So you're not going to hear anything novel. You're frankly not going to hear anything that's brand new. This is a continuation of a long dialogue, the fundamental focus of which is we do good work, council's given us good direction. How do we make sure we actually continue and realize on the capacity and priority of those directions? So if I can have the first slide, this is an acknowledgement of what we already know, that I've been here 3 times. And that, fundamentally, the first time I was here with some pretty soft language around a thought experiment and how would this actually work. Second time, quite a bit more sharp in terms of clarity of interrelated challenges and basically some fairly challenging messages. I think, from the perspective of, do we actually know what we're doing? Do we have a long-term strategic vision? How does that actually relate back into our fiscal plan? And now I'm back on the eve of some advice to council with a long-term financial plan, or a vision for basically how to close that gap. And I'm linking that in explicitly into the advice I think is necessary for council as it returns in 2018. As kind of an explicit recognition that really, we are going to need to deal with some of these things in the light of a new council and make some progress. And I'm trying to set the stage for that dialogue with a new council. I do want to acknowledge that Toronto is an exceptional city, that we actually are a global experiment in living together. We have enjoyed and continue to enjoy exceptional, in fact, extraordinary growth. We are an Ontario and a national actor, and as we look through any of those rankings, whether it's quality of life, investment attraction, anything like that, we are privileged to be at the very, very top of those lists. That is not an easy accomplishment, and we should be comfortable with that. But that should not blind us and cannot blind us to that kind of core reality we have, that there are areas of really big failure in this city. And we do not have the system that we require from a congestion and transit perspective. Our housing and our affordability is not what it should be for the quality of life of so many of our city. And I'm just going to choose one index, but that's child poverty. And right now, 1 in 5 kids in the city are underneath the low income cutoff. The provincial figure is 1 in 10. That 1 in 10 figure is completely and utterly unacceptable. 1 in 5. And we know from the research, we know from our guts, we just know the opportunity lost as a function of that. So we're in great shape. We are in a moment, but we should not lose sight of those core pieces. And frankly, those of us who are privileged to be in public service and leadership positions should be talking about it and should be working to address those challenges. And I say that not only as a civic administrator, but as somebody who has had a long experience in a different level of government. And I believe that is core to what public servants should be doing and have an obligation to address. There is, I think, good news and on these things, which is a council. And the council I'm privileged to work for and with has actually given us active and positive strategies. And I'm going to break them here for convenience into 2 categories. And I understand that the categorization is not quite right, and there's argument both ways. But basically, I think I'm trying to break it into a nice little bundle of those things that we do that fall into the category of traditional services to property. And those are solid waste, police, parks, some of our forestry and recreation, ravines, all of these things. We have in place a large number of strategies and a large number of delivery mechanisms. They are, I think, fundamentally important, and I think they do a great job. I'm actually going to talk about the solid waste one in just a sec, but I think we do a really good job on those things. We also have a whole bunch of really good plans that council has directed us as staff. We have brought in front of council, and council has approved on an aspirational basis for transportation and transit network, poverty, fighting poverty through TO Prosperity, Tenants First, Transform Toronto, which is our effort to show some leadership in actually combating the key sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and a whole variety of things. And we'll continuously add, and frankly, we add to that list in every council meeting. There's something I want to say about these plans, which is they're actually really good plans. And if I actually look at how they square up and how they link into and how they compare to, frankly, the plans we see at a national or a provincial level, ours are good. Like, they're practical, they make sense, they're implementable, and if implemented, as many of them are, they will actually make a tangible difference in the quality of life of our residents. So they are things that I think matter. I think they're things in a public interest, and they're things that council has directed the creation of, and council has directed the implementation of. The question is, can we actually get there? I'm going to talk a little bit about those barriers and others in a few minutes. There is, I think, also a fundamental focus on affordability from council. And council gives me 2 sets of directions all the time, and they are around these strategies, but also with a very clear focus on affordability. And that's expressed in 2 ways. First, a limit in terms of residential property tax as our major source, our single largest source of revenue, indexed to inflation. And the other is expressed very directly through an annual expense constraint. And I do want to talk a little bit about how we've actually been able to achieve something on the annual expense constraint. And this is expense history, real per capita, obviously adjusted for inflation and population growth. And you'll notice that it's flat to negative. And I want you to compare, that's a long time. That's 7 years of no growth invested. And I want you to think about the number of public policy positive announcements by government over that period of time. I think it's really an extraordinary story of what the City of Toronto has been able to fit into a flat funding envelope. And if we adjust that as a share of GDP, which is actually the better measure, you're going to see that not flat, but you're going to see that actually falling. There is absolutely no justification for claiming that city expenses are out of control. There is absolutely no justification for saying that the city is somehow less affordable than it has been in the past. There is a reality that the public servants who work with me, the public servants who work for Toronto Community Housing, who work for the TTC, have been instructed to save money and have done a spectacular job of it. And City Council can take pride in a very low-cost government over a period of time. They have directed that, and we have delivered on that. Next slide. And I do want to emphasize that this has not, that there are some extraordinarily positive stories here. And if I look from a perspective of solid waste, and solid waste is a pretty traditional sanitation service. From a homeowner's perspective, from somebody who puts something in a bin, it is basically the same service that exists for the last, it's almost static. You put something there, it disappears. That's not actually what's happened with solid waste. Solid waste is now a service that over the last 25 years and will continuously be transformed to do 3 core things. First of all, it's actually been a relentless drive for efficiency, including contracting out and efficiency and price points for a whole bunch of the services, not only the actual front-facing services, but also things like the transfers, the actual management of the dumps, and of course the sorting of the waste streams and other pieces. But fundamentally what's happened is this linear, siloed provincial municipal service has actually been transformed in terms of, it's a nerd fest, so I don't mind using the word, its externalities. And the externalities of solid waste have traditionally been huge. They've been around really bad land use for garbage and really high GHG footprints, particularly from a municipal perspective. Those things have dropped like rocks and will continue to drop like rocks because of a long-term funded plan put together by public servants over a consistent period of time and largely funded by the City of Toronto on a long-term plan basis. So we get stuff really right. That other picture won't be familiar to many people, but it is Seton House. And it's what we want Seton House to be, and it's what Council has actually directed us to do as part of a George Street revitalization program where we are actually struggling from a civic perspective to take those who are most vulnerable, living in a wildly unsuitable long-term care setting and in a wildly unsuitable and close to inhumane environment from a shelter, and actually put together some investment, take a place that is unsafe, make it safer, and actually put some humanity, result, and capacity into that system. One is funded, the other is still aspirational, and we're obviously working to fund it. But these are frankly good plans that we have implemented and that I am desperate to implement, and I don't mind speaking positively and frankly proactively and from an advocacy perspective around the value of public policy in reducing our GHG footprint at a municipal level, contributing to a national priority, and making sure that we actually do improve the reality of very high levels of poverty in our city and begin to actually do something about that. These are things that Council has directed, we are doing, but we need capacity to fund. And here is something really important, which is that there are some challenges in dealing with those Council plans that we are directed to implement. These are pretty familiar messages, but I'm still going to go over them because I think they are important. The first is that City has taken on moderate but growing levels of risk each year to balance the budget. And first and foremost on that is reliance on unplanned increases in municipal land transfer tax. We have been continuously lucky. You know that chart I had of the 10 years of expense? I know, without even doing the arithmetic, that GDP is going to be a share of that, is going to go better because it's been 10 years of GDP growth. That's not something we can take for granted, and we sure cannot always take the land transfer tax. I'll drive that point home yet again in another slide, and also the practice of deferring known costs, and particularly known costs relative to the historic underinvestment, particularly in things like transit. So there's a gap there that we have not addressed. We've done an amazing job squeezing out the annual savings. But there is a limit. And frankly, we are approaching the edge of that limit. And there's something important about our budget process. And it's really interesting, but the budget process is actually a relentless reinforcement of the status quo on the expense side. Council is very reluctant to cut programs, even programs that public servants put forward as programs that should not necessarily exist or may not be, from an opportunity cost perspective, the optimal use of public resources. Council consistently rejects even the cost-saving proposals put forward by general managers. So, you know, in the absence of actually being able to drop a line of business, over this period of time, that 10 years of squeezing is actually running to an end. And we can always find more. We get productivity, we do these things, we work through the magic of gapping, we do all of those things on an annual basis. It's lots of fun, trust me. But you know, I can tell you that there's absolutely no justification for saying there's easy waste to find, because we've been looking for it for 10 years and we have not found it. It's nowhere near enough to offset the investment pressures associated with the reality of those programs that Council has directed us, and it's simply not going to be enough. So I'm proud to continue to drive cost control. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but we have to recognize that what we've done so far is beginning to actually push the practical limits. Our revenue adequacy and fairness is not what it should be. The revenue adequacy relative to the demands we have, relative to what Council, it does not support the vision, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the reality is the constraints in provincial oversight, and the province has not been ungenerous to us in terms of gas tax and other things. And I think we do have to recognize that the province has worked with us through the City of Toronto Act and through other mechanisms. But when we look at the kind of core value we are delivering for the province, there is some constraints. And basically, we are trying to do things that are provincial level services, I'll talk about in a second, have national and provincial ramifications on the basis of a very narrow and unflexible and very visible tax base. And that leads me to the next point, that ultimately we will need to have a dialogue, and as painful as it may be, we actually do need to have a dialogue about the Toronto-Ontario fiscal framework and actually Toronto's role, very meaningful role in driving provincial and national priorities. And this is not a trap. This is not something that I think needs to happen right now, but as we look forward to a new council, returning council, and the aftermath of provincial government, I think this will be a time when we can pause and actually begin these fundamentally important dialogues. So that brings me to the next slide, which is basically in anticipation of a new council. Here's my perspective as a city manager. Great plans, and I'm proud of those plans. I'm proud of what we do, I'm proud of the plans. Too many barriers, not enough money, not enough time. So what do you do then? Well, I think we actually need to sit back and have a dialogue around how we deliver on those real and important aspirations. And this is frankly part of the maturing process of what is now a 20-year-old City of Toronto. This is an enormously powerful, enormously important place. It has, in cash flow terms, $14 billion at its disposal. It deals with on that on a transactional basis. It will always have to deal with that on a transactional basis, but it also has strategic and leadership capacity that we need to realize, and we need to begin to lever and use and drive. And that brings me to the next slide, and I'm very pleased to be at the University of Toronto, because then I can acknowledge, in the best traditions of scholarship and acknowledging the efforts of others, this is straight stolen. This is stolen from some work that Gabe Edelman led, Sivan and others were on the task force, but a practical blueprint for change, final report from the City Hall Task Force earlier this year, SPPG. That's School of Public Policy for Governance, for those who didn't get to teach there like I did. This is really, from my perspective, dead obvious. Somebody needs to actually put together a somewhat more coherent vision and actually begin to drive that. In this case, they recommend the mayor. I'm frankly going to pick up on that and say that we do need some type of framework setting where we begin to actually lay out and structure a clearer vision associated with that. I believe that profoundly. I think that is important. I think, Gabe and company, you provide an excellent recommendation. And in the best tradition or the worst tradition of the public service, I'm not going to constrain what I mean by that. And here's what I mean by that. And again, in keeping with the slightly nerdy orientation, I lay out 3 arbitrary public policy paths here. And there is a legitimate set of policy choices associated with the future path. And it is entirely legitimate that council decide that it really wants to focus in on services to property, and that it wants to behave as most other municipalities do, which is to focus in on those things that are actually kind of directly required or contracted by the province and are kind of very traditional services to property in a relatively traditional and narrow way, and to focus on getting those as efficient as you possibly can. In order to deliver that, we would actually have to take responsibility for stepping away from a bunch of policy areas. Not only not doing the things that council is committed to and asked us to plan and has announced, but actually stepping away from a bunch of things. And that means, yes, we could live with a smaller revenue footprint. And let's not make any mistakes. Our revenue footprint as a share of the economy is persistently getting smaller over time, as I indicated earlier, because expense, remember, and revenue balance in our world. So if we actually want to live with a small government piece, even if we want to just live with the slow incremental tax cuts associated with the way we are currently running the finances, we will need to step away from programs. Not only, to be clear, step away from doing the things that we've committed, but actually stepping away from actual programs. That's a legitimate public policy choice. I know that some will be in favor of that, and frankly, it's a public policy choice that I could administer. But it needs clarity, it needs direction, and it needs consistency. As an alternative, we could focus in on maintaining existing service levels, whether we maintain them in terms of the number of community centers now or the number of community centers adjusted for population. In either of those cases, just given some of the inherent cost ratchets and other things, we probably do need incremental revenue. We can probably not, given the risk we've put into the plan, we cannot probably legitimately fund what we have now on a consistent basis without some actual modest increase in revenue to hold to our current service levels and to actually manage at an acceptable level the risk we have going forward. But council hasn't really directed that. What they've actually directed is broader city building. And council has consistently leaned towards broader city building in terms of, basically a variety of things that are required, and these things would be required. So those things I talked about that are aspirational, and some of those things like actually realizing some of the poverty reductions or TO prosperity and transform TO and a variety of other things, will in a practical sense require an increment in revenue. That can be phased over a period of time, but they will require significant increases in revenue and significant changes in the way in which the City of Toronto does business. So these are arbitrary. This isn't meant to be anything but a way of forcing something that's really important. Council cannot rationally expect me as a public servant to deliver on number C, the expense on number C, with the revenue box on number A. And when we come back, particularly given the risk we've had, this is something we are frankly going to have to address. This is something that requires, from the perspective of responsible government, responsible and mature outcomes, from the perspective of actual civic legitimacy, we are going to have to bring those things together and actually have that dialogue. Next slide is that council does need to provide that direction. That is a political direction. That is a priority setting exercise that council needs to take and will take responsibility to deliver. No matter what, I actually think there are lots of areas in which we as public servants can work increasingly well with council in order to actually improve the way in which we deliver public services. And I'm going to go through these things in a more categorical way in a minute, but I do think that there are opportunities to provide better information and actually help the City of Toronto not only engage in the transactional decision making that it does now, but actually understand and appreciate a little bit more of the impact of its decisions over time and some of the profoundly important things that we are actually trying to do together. I will say that I believe there are opportunities to further develop value for money and actually provide better outcomes at lower or equal costs. That's not going to be sufficient to bail us out, but it is something that we need to do. Adequate, fair, and efficient revenue has not been a priority in terms of our conversations. We have tended to treat revenue as a very brief conversation into the annual budget cycle. I don't think that's right. I think we actually do need to have a dialogue around our revenue mix and how we come to balance. That does mean that we actually need to understand something a little bit more broadly, which is about our overall civic health and the fiscal plan and how that goes over a period of time. And I will return, of course, to the Toronto-Ontario fiscal framework. So let me go through these levers relatively quickly, and I call them levers. They're actually probably best understood as bundles of information to support strategic decision making. And I believe profoundly as a public servant that we do a great job in providing a huge amount of information, practical, detailed, important, transparent information to councillors and to the broader public about our budgetary process. There is an incredible amount of detail in that information. But I don't think that we actually meet the mark in terms of some really important areas. We don't actually explain what happened in prior years. We don't actually explain what our plans were and what's actually happened. So from a strategic planning or business management perspective, we actually treat the budget process as a fresh start every year. That's not right. We need to go back and explain what the plans were, how they worked out. We need to establish what the ramifications of those plans are on a going forward basis, on a real basis. And my partners in civic administration, in Toronto Community Housing and TTC, are effectively on the operating side given one-year budgets. They cannot have strategic plans with any certainty. Their boards cannot hit the mark of realistic strategic planning without an understanding of what those budget constraints and what those opportunities are on a multi-year basis. So I believe that these are things that we can do better, and I think that we can actually use that opportunity on a multi-year basis to actually begin to talk much more realistically about the impacts of our budget on the economy, on equity, on gender, and a whole bunch of other issues. Same thing will apply for capital budgeting process, including the opportunity for really important things like peer review. Really important things like actually allowing council and having a better and more rigorous and more evidence-based priority setting process. So I do believe that there are opportunities over a period of time, and we cannot do this as a public service on the basis of the resources we have overnight, but it is something that I think we can actually improve over a period of time. Next is value for money. And I do not believe that we are going to be able to easily find significant savings. And as indicated, there's no conceivable way that the savings we can find will be sufficient to actually offset or drive some of the very major investments that Council has directed take place and directed that we plan for. But I do believe that we have to understand that we are, from a civic perspective, that we do have a couple, three major cost drivers. I'm going to deal with the bottom one first, which is capital and financing costs. And one of the remarkable things about our budget, one of the remarkable things about our strategic budget process, is that we treat it as a surprise every year that interest costs rise from those things that we decided to buy the last couple of years. And we appear to be genuinely surprised about it. We don't appear to have made that room in our multi-year budget process. So we actually have got to recognize that, and we actually have to build in the operating ramifications of capital plans on a multi-year basis. And that's not a value for money thing, but that is fundamental to my view about how we need to improve our budgeting process. There's a ton of things we can do in terms of modernizing government. We do need to, as I indicated earlier, give our investment partners, our strategic delivery partners in TTC, TCHC, and the other corporations much more budget certainty about where they're going over a period of time. We have, between us and the agency, something like $2.5 billion worth of procurement. We have only one procurement mechanism, which is the call. which is the RFP. We have a few others we use from time to time, but fundamentally, this is a great way of showing that we did something under diligence, but it's not necessarily the best way of discovering value. Given that, I do think we need to have a broader conversation about transformation of procurement. And we will actually have to talk with our bargaining agents openly and honestly about the cost of public services, about the ratchet effect of some of our built-in wage aspects, about the very challenging arbitration settlements we receive from time to time, about the rising package and benefit costs and a variety of other things. And you know, that sounds like a terrible right-to-sing concept, but I will say that in my 30 years working for the Government of Ontario, and you know, 20 years of those being fiscal, those covered 3 different governments of 3 very different stripes. That conversation was front and center, and that's part and parcel of decent civic administration, to actually have the costs about how you invest in public services and not just public servants. So I say that maybe a little bit too vitriolically, but I believe it passionately that these are the kinds of conversations we need to have, and they are absolutely critical for the social permission for something that really does matter, because that savings not going to be sufficient to get us where we need to go. We need to begin to talk meaningfully and realistically about revenue and about how that will actually work. And this is an important slide because you guys understand it well. There's an index, and we've indexed revenue sources at 2011 to 0, and you can see basically the way they go. I can read it for you if I want, but really there's a message there that everything grows moderately with the exception of land transfer tax. And you know, we are balancing each and every year on the basis of land transfer tax, and it's a fantastic thing. You know, thank goodness the province has been generous and given us the capacity to have land transfer tax, and thank goodness at about this time last year, the Ontario Minister of Finance decided to raise land transfer tax, and we could rush in there right behind that and pick up there and basically call it parallel and get that through. That's a fantastic, fantastic outcome, and it's actually going great this year. Unbelievably, it's actually going great. Nevertheless, you know, that's not right. And it's not right from a couple of perspectives. It's not right from a risk perspective. And I'm going to talk about it again in a second. Next slide, please. It's not right from an equity perspective. And it's not right from an equity perspective that we actually have a property tax that overtaxes business, and through business actually overtaxes people who rent. It's not right that our land transfer tax is kind of an arbitrary tax imposed equally on business and individuals at arbitrary points in time. That's not an equitable, fair, efficient, or stable funding mechanism. I'm not at all comfortable with a user fee model that in practical terms prices the TTC almost up to the margin, so that if we raise transit fares, we might well see a reduction in ridership. I'm now chair of the Toronto Parking Authority. I can tell you that we price parking below market. Our official policies are to encourage transit use over vehicle use, for congestion management, for GHG, for safety, for all of those really incredibly important services, and yet our pricing model of public goods is actually the reverse of that. I think that's a really important dialogue that we need to start and drive. We have massive tax expenditures that are not well understood, that account for like a real chunk of change that are probably necessary in some respects, but we don't actually spend. The budget process goes through and rings out, looks really closely line by line, and we have maybe $500 million of money sitting there in tax preferences that frankly is not looked at on an annual basis or really on any basis. That's not true. We're actually looking at the IMFG program right now, just to be clear. But nevertheless, these things are, in my view, not well understood, not well accounted for, something that we need to do. And I got to be clear, I really do think that we do need to consider revenue options for focusing on revenue quality and stability, and actually that probably means in a practical sense looking at broadening the tax base as well. An absolutely critical, necessary dialogue that I think we need to have. And those people who think that we can get by with less revenue, or that somehow we can deliver the package of services that we're delivering now, let alone the ones we're directed to do on the future, that is magical thinking. That's not going to happen. there is a core reality here. There's almost physics level of certainty. We are going to require some change in our revenue behavior and approach, and we do need to get to it. The next slide is, I think it's really important, and just at the level of intuition, I expect lots and lots of people have a pretty good understanding of whether or not the 2017 federal budget or the 2017 Ontario budget improves or deteriorates the fiscal situation of the province or the country. I think a whole lot less people, including decision makers, don't actually know whether or not the 2017 Ontario civic budget does the same thing. Partly because it's actually really hard to know. And I think part's that the information gap that we have. We actually do need, and I think we owe as public servants, the public and council, a better understanding of really what is the underlying fiscal health of the city. Are our debt levels too low or are they too high? I think there's actually a really good argument that we can make room for additional debt and finance additional things, but we're going to have to make some room on the operating side right away. So we need to actually have that conversation around debt. We can take a good solid look at how our reserves stand relative to those in other jurisdictions and how they stand against things like our employment liabilities that are real, growing, and will impact our fiscal health at some point. Revenue assets is a code word for what I really mean, which is we should make sure that we are running Toronto Hydro, the Toronto Parking Authority, and any of our assets in an efficient way that actually provides as much revenue as we can, or if we want them to be run from a public interest standpoint, that we actually define and hold them accountable for those public interest goals. I've already made it clear that I think there is room on the Toronto parking side to realize additional value from that asset just by making sure that we price it appropriately. And I think this does lead to broader financial health indicators. I know instantaneously as a civic administrator what's actually happening on net debt in the province of Ontario, and I know what that means federally and provincially. I don't actually know what that is in our world. I think that's something that we owe and need to spend a little bit of time on. That's why it's a nerdy conversation. That's actually kind of it, is we do actually need to understand these things. And finally, I actually think that we actually do need to continue to have the dialogue, and this is not a hostile dialogue. This is a dialogue around how we actually, in conjunction with the province, can begin to recognize and do things, I think, even better than we do together. And I do believe that Toronto delivers services that benefit the region and the province. And obviously, housing, obviously the ridership, and obviously the children living in LICO. And the province, to be very clear, is working hard on the children living in LICO, and the Government of Canada both have consistently increased and worked on things like the child benefit and a variety of other things. So those are really, really important. But also the lived experience of those kids is going to be unbelievably heavily impacted by where they are, by neighborhood level factors, by our community centers, by all of those things. That is a really, really important thing, I think, and we as the city are actually producing services that actually, from an opportunity perspective, from a broad perspective, actually have profound ramifications provincially. And the Transform TO, when it gets funded and when it's implemented, is going to be among the most effective things we can do in lowering greenhouse gas. There's a real promise and a real integrity to those efforts. We're going to actually have to make some room for that. I think we need to actually have that dialogue. A little bit more viscerally, we are seeing risks to public health associated with opioids, and we know. We actually, these slides are really dry. We actually know that lives are lost. We actually know that these are young people who are disproportionately losing their lives. And in terms of potential life years lost or any other measure, these are unbelievably tragic situations. We're seeing more opiate deaths than homicides and traffic deaths combined. And that's a deeply frightening thing if we think about our families. We think about that. And we know from research and from practicality that interventions matter. And we know that some of the interventions that matter are supervised injections and other things. And we know the Government of Canada has a role. We know that the province of Ontario has a role. But what's really interesting about that is that one of the most effective and operationally important aspects of that fight, and we do need to take on that fight, actually occurs at the local level. and is actually to some extent constrained at the local level. And we actually need to recognize that the City of Toronto, when it does that, is actually when it actually struggles with those issues, is actually struggling on those issues on behalf of the country and on behalf of the province. And this isn't a hit against anybody, just kind of a recognition that what we're doing is something fundamental. And just from a slightly different perspective, we know that the province of Ontario is struggling with the reality of emergency room crowding. We know from research, we know from practicality, that that's not going to be solved in the hospital sector, that's going to be solved in the community sector. City of Toronto is very much overrepresented in that community sector. We need to begin to have that dialogue. So this isn't a money dialogue. This isn't a who pays for what and who gets benefit. It's a dialogue around how, from a client, operational, from an impact perspective, we actually take the step back in a post-election environment to actually reinstitute the dialogue around how we can do better together, which is, of course, the next slide, which is really, we actually do need to figure out the mix of services, how that works. We do need, from a civic perspective, to match progressively growing revenue severance with those things that are regional and provincial outcomes, or we need to have policy direction to go back to that smaller government size. But if we're not doing that, and the City of Toronto has never said that, in that crude little matrix, they always go for someplace between B and C and generally towards C. That is the revealed preference. We're actually going to have to match that with some more revenue and some more capacity. I think, frankly, that's going to require Toronto leadership, cooperation, and investment to work with the province and lever provincial and national change. And the last slide is pretty straightforward. It's an upcoming new term of council. We're going to begin. Appropriate opportunity. Council's going to give us some direction. We have to bring the revenue, the expense part of those directions together. And frankly, I'm going to pledge, as you would expect I would, the cooperation of the Toronto Public Services. I'll speak with the agencies. We're going to work together collaboratively and constructively, strategically, but we look forward to supporting a council that's going to give us directions to do the right thing, make the investments, work with our provincial and national partners, and continue to make the progress that we have made so far, but that is nowhere near adequate. I'm going to stop yelling at you right now for a minute. I'm going to let Sivan ask me some questions, start yelling again, and then ultimately you'll get a chance to ask me questions and start yelling at me.
Never disappoint. And this
it's not actually true.
Well, okay, in this regard, I won't speak about every aspect of life, but in this regard, you never disappoint. And we've got a more informal setting this year, so we're just gonna chat about a few pieces that you highlighted. So within a year, we're going to see another election, and it would seem that the gravy train will make its way through the station. I heard you say very clearly that costs are under control, that there really is no more fat to cut, that the gravy has been scooped, and I'm wondering if you could just drill down a little bit more about that, in particular around the world of the agencies. Because in particular, I think it sounds like 40% of the forecasted expenditure growth is coming from that area. So what is the next train in that station?
So I want to distance myself a little bit from the notion of a gravy train. I don't think there's any evidence that we can actually fund the type of activity that Council has directed us to undertake and plan for on the basis of pure savings. I think, frankly, the Toronto Public Service, and from what I can understand, agencies have done a very, very good job within the policy constraints of annual targets. I don't think that we can legitimately claim, at least in my world, that we've maximized the efficiency of our expenditure. I actually do believe that if we look at a more fundamental way about the aspects of our procurement, if we actually understand, and we have an Auditor General who does consistently point out and has made, from my perspective, perhaps an overly easy living, reviewing our procurement practices and finding them to be at fault. So I do actually think that there are ways in which we actually can generate additional value for money. And I do think that as civic managers, we actually need to put more of an emphasis on management. And right now, we actually have an engaged and important and in almost all respects lovely civic workforce. But we do have high levels of employee absenteeism. We do not necessarily have an integrated platform that allows us to take the learnings from enforcement or investigation that takes place in public health, fire, building, licensing, and standard, and integrate them into a risk-based platform and actually maximize the efficiency. This is all complete management nerd talk. But we are a long ways away from a data-driven, high reliability, and fully cost-efficient organization. We're not going to get there through annual slicing. You know, bleeding the patient is not actually the right strategy. We're actually going to have to step back and actually decide what are the priorities, and frankly, we're going to have to invest in management, and we're going to have to invest in systems, and we're going to have to go through the failures of the cycles of failure that are traditionally associated with that, which we have not done. The City of Toronto has not done that to the extent that other places have, the private sector, but also I know factually the province. So I'm never going to claim that there's not actually significant opportunities for saving and efficiency. I'm just going to say that it requires very different behavior to get there. And it will require investment in change, and it will require investment in management and technology. And those investments don't go well the first time. You know, like they require some effort, they require some teething pains. And to be very clear, Council has given us money. And we've oftentimes tended to take that money and put it into an IT solution rather than a business re-engineering solution and a variety of other things like that. And this is why, you know, Council, I asked for Council to give me the resources to create the position of a Chief Transformation Officer, and why we are engaged in exactly that process. So while I'll distance myself from the notion of it's easy, I will never distance myself from the opportunity to actually realize more efficiency and more savings, because I do frankly think that there is an opportunity to do that, and I think we owe that to the public, to Council, and I think that is something we will continue to pursue. But you know, the easy stuff is done, okay. And the other easy way, which is just to get rid of a line of business, is not on. Okay. And the other easy way, which is just, you know, shave the system a little bit and kind of not quite meet the performance measures, yeah, we kind of done that. Like that's getting a little bit old, so I do think we are going to need a different and more realistic approach to realizing, I don't even want to call it savings, because it's not so much savings. It may not be that we return the money, it's that we can actually deliver the service levels we're purporting or contracting to deliver. Municipal licensing and services was at, you know, 500 and change a few years ago. It's at 400 and low change. I want you to think a little bit about, you know, what's come onto that world in the last little while in terms of a denser city. You know, 5 years of 1 or 2% population growth. We've had the emergence of a sharing economy and a new regulatory framework, both to design and then implement for transportation network companies, and of course for, you know, platform sharing like Airbnb. And we're about to have that organization take over the noise complaints that have traditionally been handled by the Toronto Police Services, which is a great recommendation. We're happy to do it, but that's still on that same 400 people with the same technology platform. That's not going to work.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. I was pleased to see policy lever number 5. This talks about the new Toronto-Ontario fiscal framework. Frankly, your experience at the province puts this in, I think, a really great standing to have any chance of success. Some of the powerful stats that you cite as to why Toronto does need a different deal with the province, that we have 20% of the province's population, but 90% of the public housing in the GTA, 37% of the total social housing in the province, and the TTC alone carries about 60% of all transit ridership of the province. So that part of the narrative has been augmented, that reality is not new. What makes you think or optimistic that with a new term of council and following the June election, provincial level, we might see a new deal for Toronto within the provincial framework?
So I want to be clear here. I'm not actually talking about a new deal, and I'm not really, frankly, you know, I'm not putting who does what back on the slide deck or proposing to blame my to go after that. I actually think the province has been in many respects quite generous. I think the gas tax money, I think we're seeing increasing investment in housing. There needs to be some credit, and I think we have to have some nuance and understanding of that. we also need to recognize that these artificial distinctions we have between provincial services and municipal services are increasingly unimportant. And we are actually seeing, and you know, maybe we need to look at the not-for-profit or the charitable service for a little bit of inspiration here. And Bruce McGregor and I work together on the United Way, and there is no longer a barrier between United Way York Region and United Way Toronto. And the same thing is happening with Peel voting to join, Peel United Way voting to join the broader United Way effort of already combined. And that's a fundamental reflection of some of these borders that exist, either within the service world or within the geography, are really nonsensical when you come to deal with some of these broader policy issues we have right now. And I think we actually begin to need to look at these things from the perspective of the transportation network. I think we begin to need to look at them from the standpoint of public health, from the standpoint of poverty being embedded in specific geographies, and whether or not those geographies are one side or the other of 416 or 905, or whether or not the exact funding mechanism is provincial or local, is not really the point. The idea I think we need to do is actually have these exercises driven from a client perspective. So this isn't kind of, I'm from Toronto, I want more money, I need to be better treated. It's actually a little bit of a different message, starting with the people we serve. And I don't think that I think it is something that we need to work our way, way through. But if we are going to expect, and we are going to expect the City of Toronto to deliver services that profoundly do things that are profoundly important for national goals, like GHG, or provincial goals, we are going to actually have to figure out ways of integrating those programs, recognizing those programs, and potentially creating some room to fund them. And that can be done in all sorts of different and important ways. To be crystal clear, there's no ultimatum. There's a dialogue I think we need to have over a period of time. And I'm going to be frank, I take some real inspiration from the community sector. As they begin to leave those traditional kind of, I'm from this region, I'm from that, they leave it behind and look at it from a client-centric, outcome-driven basis, and they do that on the basis of metrics.
Mm-hmm. This point around national and provincial goals takes me to my next question, and it involves pot. So Canada Day.
I do wish I'd asked you for the questions.
Canada Day.
I know I said I didn't need them, but I do wish I'd asked.
Canada Day is a big day for our country, and frankly for the tax revenue base for at least two of the three orders of government. The amounts of money vary in terms of what people are estimating, but it could be in the order of magnitude of hundreds of millions of dollars. The feds and the provinces are trying to work out who gets what. What can you share with us about what the municipal expectation or play could be on this front? And is the city ready for that to become legal July 1?
So this is federal priority driven by the Government of Canada. The province of Ontario has been asked, as have the other provinces, to contribute to and to basically take the lead in the way that it works in fiscal and operational federalism in the country. I should perhaps be a little bit more careful than I am right now, but I will say I think the province of Ontario has done a really good job from a public policy perspective of working its way through into the position from which it maintains maximum flexibility and maximum ability to actually understand an evolving public interest that we frankly don't really understand. So I really do think that the province of Ontario has done a great job, not in a partisan way, not in any other way. I just think operationally, from a public service perspective, they've done a great job understanding and de-risking what is a very risky policy transition. And I don't think that this is actually about money. It may ultimately be about money, but I think when we actually look through and we actually understand the paper-thin margins that are likely to be, it's a weed. It can be grown. Your ability to actually maintain a monopoly in that world on something where the monopoly is already broken is a challenging thing. So I don't actually think it's about money. I think it's about avoiding arrest records. I think it's about avoiding massively inefficient use of police resources. I think it's about ensuring public safety and making sure that as a substance becomes more permissible, it's not available to younger communities and a variety of things like that. So there may be money, and there is undoubtedly a need to make sure that as the City of Toronto takes on inevitably additional workloads, that it's fairly compensated for those, and we don't have to cut some other priority, because that's what will happen, that we don't have to cut some other priority. So we do need that. But I actually think that the federal mandate has been clear. The province has dealt with it very responsibly. It has a good, solid public policy framework from the perspective of de-risking, which you guys have met me, I think is really important from a public policy perspective. City of Toronto, we need to fit into that framework, step up, make sure that we understand what those costs, what those benefits will be as well, and make sure that we are, from a civic perspective, appropriately compensated for those, but that we work constructively with that. And I think our partners in the province of Ontario have been very constructive, have worked with us, have sought our input, and I think our dialogue with City Council in the last council really reflected the fact that the province is, from our perspective, been an excellent partner in this.
Okay. Every year, and this is an informed audience, so this may be a report which many of you follow. So every year, Edelman does a trust barometer, and they gauge the trust of Canadians, and in fact globally, but Canadians in particular, around government, business, media, and NGOs. So in Canada, we've seen a drop in, especially last year, down. So in 2016, 55% said that they trusted government, and that's dropped down to 47%. And we're seeing that number each year go down. And you could almost call it free fall in terms of watching as that goes down. And Peter, I'm wondering, from your perspective, what does this represent to you? And what role, as the head of the public service of the City of Toronto, how does that figure into your planning and understanding of the work?
So I think there are a couple of things that we as public servants need to recognize. And I think we sometimes struggle with this a little bit, but I'm not sure that we actually always understand the relatively privileged positions public servants oftentimes have. And this is not all public servants, but for many public servants, particularly those of us who are long-serving and have access to pensions, the value of those pensions is actually quite high. And if you actually look and actually run through the detailed analysis of the share of national income that has been taken by private sector, particularly manufacturing, and the share that's been taken by the public sector, and particularly the wage envelope, there's surprising results there. And an investment in public service is not actually always the same as an investment in social justice. And I think we do need to understand that with the decimation of a lot of manufacturing jobs in particular, and the fact that those jobs have been replaced statistically by things that are much less well-paying and much less secure, the fact that the public service remains relatively constant and very secure is something that we actually have to deal with. And I think we can dismiss it and call it Trumpism or call it right-wingism or just dismiss it, but I think as public servants we dismiss that as our peril. And frankly, that's why I am so focused on value for money, and why I think that's absolutely an integral part of having the social permission. I also think, frankly, that as public servants, we need to be really honest about what we can do and what we can't do. And I think the dialogue around, if you want to have public service outcomes, and if you think that what we need to do to deal with congestion is invest more in transit, that's not free. That's not without friction. We actually have to say that. We have to take responsibility for that, and we have to deliver on that as clearly as we can. The voice of public servants is generally fairly muted, as it should be, but the other thing that we have to do is behave ethically. We actually have to live the mandate of ethical and transparent behavior.
We're going to go to open floor questions in just a moment. Before we do, you've had the unique and frankly unprecedented career history of being both the head of the Ontario Public Service and then the city, the largest municipal civil service in the country. So you've now been on both sides, uploading, downloading, giving, receiving, begging, not answering the phone. And I'm wondering, what's the one thing you wish you'd known as Secretary of Cabinet while you were at the province that you've learned since you've moved to the city?
There isn't actually one thing. It's a great question, but I'm actually really proud of the public services delivered by Ontario. And I've been tremendously proud of the public services delivered by Ontario. But when we were in the process of negotiating a very difficult and challenging collective agreement with 416 and 79, I've never been more proud of an Ontario public servant than I was of our conciliator. And when I look at the plans that we're doing now as a civic administration, and I look at some of those plans and I see how beautifully they dovetail with the provincial plans and how these are actually integrated public interest, I actually don't see, frankly, the division. I actually see the harmony and continuity. And I actually see them, frankly, as the same thing. And the more time I spend on it, the more time I just realize viscerally and in a practical sense that it's meaningless to talk about the distinction between the health sector, the primary health sector, and the community center. In terms of the actual impact on the way people live their lives, these are a continuity. They don't have breakpoints. They might have institutional breakpoints, but that's a really stupid answer, and I got to be careful how I say that. But we actually need to, as public servants and those who follow public services, we need to actually think about these things from the perspective of the impact on the populations we're privileged to serve. So I actually don't, frankly, dwell on the distinctions, and maybe it's just that I'm getting tired, but I actually see these things as coming together increasingly. And I actually think that the little slides I put up there around the opportunity for a better and renewed dialogue are not actually something I'm throwing at the province or the government of Canada. These are, I think, opportunities for us to actually think about the public services we deliver, realize that some of the distinctions we have are meaningless in the community, realize that we are funding the same organizations to do much of the same thing, and actually begin to have that dialogue in a better way. And I don't view that as a distinction. I view that as something that's coming together. So I actually see it as frankly, the integration and privilege of public service.
That's great. Okay, so we're going to go to the floor. We've got our friend here with the microphone. Please put up your hand and stand as you have a question. And we're going to do a few minutes of these Q's and A's from the floor, and the last question will be up here on the stage. So do you want to go up there? Who had their hand up first? I think at the back. Sure. We do need the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, we do need the mic. Otherwise, yep. Otherwise, I'll just answer whatever it is I want.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Anthony. Thank you for all your work, and congratulations to the Toronto Public Service for its ongoing commitment to the city. I live in a suburban community in a priority neighborhood. I was quite surprised just in my conversations in my neighborhood at how much that story of that Etobicoke senior who built that staircase for $500 and who was told by city officials that it would cost $65,000 to, I believe, $150,000. Just how much that resonated. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I'd be delighted to. So it's actually worth remembering that these impractical matters, we're not building a staircase there. We're actually building essentially a bridge. And it's not a $500 bridge. And let's remember that the preference of the Toronto Public Service was frankly to spend nothing on that, because that was not necessary. That was not a necessary staircase. That did not meet our priorities, our institutional mechanisms. There was, in a very practical way, another way through. So it was something desired by the community, but there are an enormous number of things in parks, forestry, recreation that are desired by communities at any point in time. A $500 staircase was an actual, it was a hazard. It was not a real thing. We went ahead and we responded to a community need, and we spent what we called $10,000, but that was not $10,000. That's $10,000 without accounting for the labor. So the $65,000 was a word. It was never provided in writing. It was not the real underlying actual story or narrative there. That is something that was, I think, a torque story, to be quite frank. And I think that it's a good outcome. We have a staircase. We have a staircase built relatively efficiently. It's not a $500 staircase. This also speaks, though, to a core reality. And this is something that I do think is an important lesson for the Toronto Public Service, which is that it doesn't really matter whether we think it's fair. It's what people understand. And we actually have a relatively small number of contractors who participate in those bids. We actually do need to step back and think, have we actually found the most efficient way to build those. And regardless of whether or not it should be $500 or whether or not it should be $15,000 or $60,000, is that the best price we can get? Is the prioritization right? And is the price right? And we are frankly working on that. And that is one of the leading places we are going to use our Chief Transformation Officer, is to actually stress test on Parks, Forestry, and Recreation and other areas whether or not we actually have the market segmentation right, and whether or not we can do more with less. And I think that is a challenge that we accept. So while I reject the specifics, and I do think that much of the narrative of that is false, I do think that there's an important part of that that we as public servants need to recognize, which is that in many respects we can always find ways of looking to see whether or not we can deliver public services more efficiently, and I'm frankly willing to drive that challenge and appreciate the message from the public. And I do think that the public does need to look at us and see, this costs that, does that make sense? I think that is something that we always do need to look at. So it's a good question, I appreciate it. And it's something that we as public servants need, I think, to appreciate and drive for, and understand that our money does come from a tax base.
Thank you. Next question. There we go.
Hi, thank you.
Can you stand,
Could you,
sir?
sure,
Thank
could you share some thoughts on the emerging Toronto Realty Agency, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start fairly starkly by talking about the utter irrationality of the starting point, which is that over a period of time, as a function of amalgamation and a function of what, when I was in graduate school was technically called disjointed incrementalism, we have landed and ladled on top of each other's an alphabet soup of agencies and department and overlapping requirements, accountabilities, a variety of other things that frankly would never be how you design a modern system. And I think actually frankly driven from within the civic administration, but with the partnership of the mayor and others, we've actually had the dialogue with council around that doesn't make sense. We actually have to move towards something that does make sense. And we are actually working towards an integrated body that will bring together the primary real estate holdings of the city, along with the primary real estate, the assets, along with the primary services associated with real estate, particularly those services that we do in terms of cleaning and other things, actually putting them on an integrated basis, actually harmonizing that decision, making it transparent, professionalizing that, bringing in a board process that will include council and external representation in order to make sure that that's transparent, which it has not been to date, more efficient than it is right now, and designed and delivered on a rational basis. This is incredibly difficult work. This is grinding, slogging, unpacking what's been in place, what was in place prior to amalgamation, what's been in a disjointed, incremental way added on top of. These are people's jobs and people's feelings, so it's actually quite challenging to do it. Council has, we've undertaken a task force, we've undertaken a consulting review, we've gone to council, we've got the permission, we're continuing to report in to council. I think it's one of those projects that demonstrates to me that frankly, the Toronto Public Service can lead and can move us to a place where we are delivering better value for money. And it is something that I think is a really good project. It will have teething pains. It will have teething pains as it works its way through. Part of the challenge will be that those teething pains will be attributed to the new organization. The reality is that the old organization had some pretty big inefficiencies and teething issues as well, but we're going to work our way through that. And I'm frankly proud of the leadership that our staff, Josie Scioli in particular, now Deputy City Manager Josie Scioli, is showing on that project.
Question. Yes, you, sir, with the beard. Yep, that's you, sir.
Goatee.
Goatee? My apologies.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Always very clear, in-depth, and thought-provoking. So much to talk about, but I wonder if you could help me with some numbers. As you're probably aware, the 2016 audited statement showed a surplus of $1.2 billion, of which $800 million was unbudgeted. And going back, I think 8 years, the numbers are, I think, a $7.4 billion surplus, and 3.4 billion of that was unbudgeted surplus. And as I recall, most of that was underspending, looking at it. So you were talking about, being deliberate about lowering costs. So is all that unbudgeted surplus from deliberate actions on the part of management to underspend what the city had asked you to spend? or is that some kind of a management issue? Just what's up with all that?
So it's a great question, and let me speak to, first of all, I'm tempted, I won't bother, but put lever number 3 around, or the first bundle of levers, which is basically around information. And this is actually something, and let me talk apples to apples first. So the annual surplus of the City of Toronto against the budgeting format. So, the cash flow through the place is on the order of $14 billion. The annual surplus, expense minus revenue, apples to apples, cash-based basis, is on the order of $150 million. That is a function of underspending. We don't want it to be a function of overspending. There is naturally some caution. Generally speaking, large organizations, particularly governments, underspend against their fiscal constraints. It would be a very bad thing if we overspent against that. So that's not a management issue. That's just the way things are. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be managing the calendarization and the cash flow on a better basis. Doesn't mean in particular that we have always understood that capital projects generally lag, and we need to do a better job actually adjusting the cash flows to meet the opportunity and to meet the reality of our construction projects. But that's kind of, $100 million or so issue against a very large cash backdrop, and that's the cash to cash number and the budget to budget number. The public accounts are done on an accrual basis. They're done on a very different basis of accounting, and that's actually part of the problem we have. And not every public administrator will agree with me, but the CD Howe will once again show us, will actually show again that the City of Toronto prepares its budget and its final report on 2 different accounting bases, and that leads to a profound confusion. I didn't bother putting it up on the slides, but that's one of those things that from an information perspective needs to be cleared up, and we need to show those things on an apple-to-apple basis. I do not believe that on a practical basis there is material underspending in the City of Toronto. I do not believe that there is lapsed opportunity to spend beyond the kind of traditional issues we have around capital, project management, and to some extent some of the issues like our challenges in filling positions and a variety of things like that. So they're management issues, they're real management issues, we need to do better, but they're not the types of numbers shown by the fairly arbitrary switch to accrual accounting, which is a very different basis, and we don't show the budget on that basis, so you're not going to get an accurate comparison.
We have time for one last question. The gentleman at the back. Yes, thank you. And we're going to do this.
But just to be very clear, I love accounting, and I actually think I don't want to be remotely dismissive of this question, because I think it's actually fundamentally important, and I think people oftentimes don't understand that the way we measure and present numbers fundamentally often determines the decision making.
I saw the auditor's worksheets, and they're different from what you're talking about.
But yeah.
Another discussion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Can you stand, sir?
I noted with some interest your comment about the United Way and some of the lessons that can be learned when it comes to service delivery. So when it comes to a thorny issue like fare integration to allow, regional transit to happen in a more effective way, from your seat, can you give us some insights onto how you see it?
I can, and I'm actually very pleased that the province of Ontario has made the moves it has on fare integration, and I think it's actually a very positive step in the right direction. Actually, a useful starting point is to actually look at where the current system is right now, where far from having a transportation network, we actually have a situation in which, for example, somebody coming from the beach in Toronto has a choice about, somebody from Maine and Danforth has a choice, and they can take the subway and a subway down or a bay bus down to go downtown, or they can hop on the GO train. There's a massive price differential for what is essentially exactly the same public good. That makes no sense at all. And what we're increasingly doing, what fare integration is a commitment to do, is to actually begin to look at this from the perspective of the actual public service delivered, rather than, and pricing it rationally from that perspective. We're not there yet. This is a small step. It's a temporary step. It's designed as a project, but it's actually a really good way of moving in the right direction and making sure that we can rely on both provincial and Toronto assets, transit assets, price them in a way that is at least more rational than it has been in the past, and move towards a hopefully a better outcome. I don't want to overstate this. I want to be very clear. This is a step in the right direction. It's a welcome step. You know, the City of Toronto still is actually the main operator. It is, you know, disproportionately covering, you know, we have an amazingly efficient, from an operating recovery standpoint, transit system. Obviously, I think that should be the focal point of any conversation, is actually how we bring additional resource into the reality of the TTC. So I welcome fare integration. It's a great step. It's not the only step that needs to take place.
So last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Enid. This is an informal one, Peter. So one of my favorite books is called The President's Club, and it documents the unique relationship as presidents leave office and their successors take over. This is in the American context, of course. One of the great traditions is that the outgoing president leaves a note on the Oval Office desk with parting advice to the person who's taking over that role. Now, Peter, we all hope you're in your role for many, many years, and we expect to see you back here next year for this talk. But when the day comes that you will vacate your office in City Hall, what would you put on your note to your successor?
So we all know the three envelope comment. Does it? Okay, just so the three envelope comment is you know, you come into your office and there's a, you know, it's a beautiful office. You're really privileged to have this new leadership position, and there's three envelopes in the desk, and it says really clearly, your successor says, just open the envelopes, but not before you have to. And the first envelope, he hands you your hand, and it says, you know, blame me. And you know, you spend a year blaming your predecessor, absolutely, and that's what you do, and it works actually beautifully till you realize that this is, you know, sounding a little bit thin, and your inability to actually accomplish something is beginning to weigh a little heavily on you. It takes maybe a year, 18 months. So you open up the second envelope and it says reorganize. What a fantastic idea. You reorganize the daylights out of thing. That works for a while till finally, you know, the fact that reorg doesn't work either is weighing heavily on you. Their hounds are baying. You open up the third envelope, it says write out three envelopes. And if you haven't heard that one, it's actually a pretty good practical piece of advice. The other thing is to actually make it crystal clear it was all right when I left, regardless of what's there. So the advice I would always give is privilege and perspective. And public servants serve at the direction of their political leadership, and we should not substitute ourselves for that political leadership. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't provide appropriate and edgy and public interest advice, but that critical distinction between what we do, which is what is directed, and what we want to do is one that we provide in advice, and that we have to remember, and we have to actually treat that with extraordinary seriousness. And the other thing that I would always offer as kind of advice to anybody taking a role, but anybody taking especially the two most senior roles that I've been enormously privileged to have, is that as public servants we have three levers. The first I've already talked about, which is our advice. The second is that we are given an extraordinary opportunity to actually have an impact on the allocation of fiscal resources. And while we do that through the approvals we bring from a cabinet or from a city council, that's an extraordinary privilege, and we need to understand and take that enormously seriously. And the reality that those are you know, taken, those are coercively taken from others. We have to recognize the reality of that. And the third, and perhaps the one that is, from my perspective, the dearest, is that you know, you have these enormous public service resources. You know, City of Toronto, you mentioned the number, over 30,000 people. And we actually have to, you know, leave the place better for our successors. And that actually means having a dialogue, and having a real dialogue around how we use the human resources. So, you know, it is to actually have an orientation, an ethical orientation about how you deliver your advice, how you advocate, and actually how you allocate real money that comes from real people, and actually how you work with your colleagues, and how you, from, you know, every day demonstrate not leadership, but how you actually work with your colleagues to achieve a public interest goal. I'd never write that down, but, you know, that would be the orientation of the dialogue. But these are, just to be clear, fantastic jobs, and whoever gets them, I'm going to keep mine for a while, but whoever gets them will be enormously privileged.
Indeed. 33,000 employees, the City of Toronto, 1 in a million right here. Thank you, Peter, for sharing your comments
Thank you so
tonight.
much. Thank you.
What a wonderful and inspiring way to end this conversation. It certainly has been a fascinating and very candid presentation and discussion. Have you ever left one of these sessions and thought, well, what does Peter really think? We know what Peter really thinks. Personally, Peter, you got me at the beginning when you started talking about numbers mattering and all that policy nerd talk. You obviously get the numbers really well, even talking about accrual accounting and cash accounting. But you also, at the same time, speak very passionately about the city and what those numbers are all about. It's about reducing child poverty and solving the opioid crisis, building better homeless shelters like Seton House. So what a great combo for a city manager to have the passion for the city and a command of the numbers. I think you've also highlighted for us the conversation that we need to have as a city, particularly going into an election year. And, you know, I've said this, you've said this. We have to figure out the kind of city we want, and then we have to figure out how we're going to pay for it. And the two go together. And you've sort of shown us that in spades and talked to us about the different kind of city and what we have to do. Sev, the tough questions. Thank you so much. You certainly made this conversation interesting. I think even Peter was surprised by some of your questions. They were terrific. You've been a great moderator. Thank you to both of you.